She needed validation. She needed acknowledgement. That evening, the man who had visited her earlier returned with another neighbor. This time, they approached cautiously, but with purpose. They knocked on her door. She opened it immediately, expecting confrontation, ready to defend herself. But they spoke calmly. "We wanted to share some information," the first man said, "just so we can avoid misunderstandings in the future. We noticed your call yesterday, and we wanted to discuss some ways to handle these situations together." The woman's face tightened. "Together?" she asked suspiciously. "You think you need to control me?" "No," he replied. "We just want clarity. To make sure everyone understands what's happening and no one gets hurt. We can work together without alarm." She stared at them, unsure whether to nod, reject, or argue. Her mind raced. They were calm, patient, and polite. And yet, their presence reminded her that she was no longer the center of authority she imagined herself to be. Others were aware now. Others had voices. And some of them were willing to speak. The conversation was long, patient, and full of pauses where she wanted to interrupt with urgency but didn't. She tried to explain her perspective, to justify her actions, to make them understand the danger she perceived. But their calm responses, their measured words, highlighted the difference between perception and reality. They asked questions, gently challenging her assumptions, encouraging her to consider alternatives. By the end of the evening, she felt uneasy, drained, and unrecognized. They left politely, wishing her good night. She closed the door, leaned against it, and let out a slow breath. She had defended herself, explained, and argued, but she had not won. They had not been alarmed. They had not needed her to protect them. Later, in her living room, she sat quietly. The notebook lay open before her. She flipped through the pages, reading her observations, her notes, her careful recordings. The weight of the past months pressed on her. She realized that yesterday's call and today's conversations had changed something. Her vigilance was no longer enough. She needed more. She needed certainty. She needed control. As night fell, the street grew quiet. Lights glowed softly from houses. Windows reflected the lamps inside. She sat by her window, looking out at the calm, peaceful neighborhood. She noticed neighbors moving about their homes, watching from a distance, their eyes attentive. She realized she was no longer alone in watching, that her actions were observed and remembered. And that knowledge was heavy. Her phone buzzed again. A message from a neighbor, politely asking if she was okay after the conversations earlier. She stared at it for a long time, unsure how to respond. She felt conflicted. Part of her wanted to reply, explain everything, assert her importance. Another part of her feared admitting anything. Fear and pride battled inside her. Finally, she put the phone down, closed the notebook, and sat in silence. The house was quiet except for the faint hum of lights and the distant sounds of the neighborhood. The sense of control she had once felt was slipping. The reassurance of her vigilance had shifted into uncertainty. The realization that she was being watched, questioned, and doubted pressed down on her, and in that quiet, the woman understood for the first time that yesterday's call had been the beginning of something larger, something she could not fully control, something that would continue to unfold slowly, deliberately, and without her full understanding. The street, the neighbors, the authorities, or a part of a story that was now beyond her alone, and she would have to navigate it carefully, cautiously, and perhaps reluctantly. The next morning felt heavier than usual. The sun rose over the street, but the light did little to chase away the tension that had settled over the neighborhood. People moved about their routines, greeting each other quietly, their movements slower, more measured. The woman woke early, restless as always, notebook on the table beside her bed. She could not shake the events of the past days. The 911 call, the officer's calm responses. The neighbors' questions had all lingered in her mind like a shadow she could not push away. She paced her living room, phone in hand, thinking of what could happen next. The weight of accountability pressed on her. Her vigilance had always made her feel powerful, in control, the protector of her street. But now, she realized that her actions had consequences she could not fully control. The officers had responded yes, but they had also asked questions she could not answer clearly. Her neighbors had watched, spoken, and recorded their own observations. She was no longer the only one who noticed. That realization made her uneasy. Later that morning, a knock came at the door. She hurried to answer, expecting another neighbor, perhaps more questions. Instead, it was an officer from the local police department. He held a folder, his expression serious but not unkind. "Good morning," he said. "We're following up on a 911 call you made recently. We'd like to ask you some questions to clarify details and ensure there are no misunderstandings." Her stomach sank. She had expected recognition, perhaps even thanks for being vigilant. Instead, she was faced with accountability. She invited him in, feeling a mix of anxiety and indignation. She sat down, notebook at the ready, trying to appear composed. The officer began calmly, asking her to recount the events of the previous day, what she saw, and why she believed it was necessary to call 911. She described her observations carefully, noting every movement, every detail she remembered. But as the conversation progressed, it became clear that some of her notes conflicted with what the officer had observed from records and body camera footage. Small discrepancies began to emerge, tiny gaps that undermined her confidence. She tried to explain, justify, and clarify, but the officer's calm tone and careful questioning made her feel exposed. "You understand," he said gently, "that making false reports can have serious consequences. Not every call results in penalties, but repeated incidents are documented and may be reviewed." She nodded quickly, though her mind raced. The word consequences echoed in her head. She had acted out of concern, out of duty, and yet it was clear that there were limits to what she could do without repercussions. After the officer left, she sat silently, staring at her notebook. Her carefully crafted sense of control had begun to crumble. Her power, which had once been her reassurance, now felt fragile. She thought of the neighbors across the street, the ones who had questioned her calmly, and of the driver she had reported. None of them had seemed afraid. None had depended on her in the way she imagined. The illusion of her authority was fading. As the day went on, whispers traveled down the street. Neighbors spoke quietly to each other, sharing observations and past incidents she had made. They were not malicious, but they were aware. Her vigilance was no longer private, and her actions were now part of the neighborhood's collective memory. The awareness of being observed, recorded, remembered pressed on her. That afternoon, she noticed that a few neighbors were approaching her more deliberately. They were calm, polite, but firm. They came not to accuse, but to discuss, to clarify, to set boundaries. One asked if she could share her observations directly with them in the future, instead of calling authorities immediately. Another suggested simple steps to prevent unnecessary alarm, like checking with neighbors before assuming danger. They spoke in a measured, reasonable tone, emphasizing cooperation over confrontation. She felt conflicted. Part of her wanted to reject their suggestions, to insist that she was right, that her vigilance was necessary. Another part of her recognized the wisdom in their words. Calm discussion and shared observation could prevent escalation and avoid unnecessary tension. Yet, accepting their advice meant admitting that she had been mistaken, that her actions were not always perfect. That acknowledgement was difficult for her pride. Evening fell, and the street grew quiet. The woman walked slowly to her window, notebook in hand, observing the calm movement of neighbors and children. The soft glow of porch lights, the shadows stretching across lawns. Her mind replayed the past days repeatedly. The call, the officer's calm faces, the driver's confused expression, the polite questions from neighbors. Each memory carried a weight she had not anticipated. She realized that her sense of being the sole guardian of the street was no longer valid. The responsibility she had assumed, the control she had believed she possessed, was now shared, scrutinized, and questioned. Others were watching, recording, and remembering, and she was part of a larger story beyond her control. That night, she opened her notebook and reviewed every entry, every observation, every detail she had noted over the past weeks. She recognized patterns, but she also noticed exaggerations, assumptions, and errors. The process of reflection was uncomfortable, forcing her to confront the reality that her perception had not always matched reality. Her own mind, so focused on vigilance, sometimes imagined danger where there was none. The phone buzzed quietly on the table. A message from a neighbor asked if she would like to meet the next day to discuss a plan for neighborhood observation and safety. She stared at it, feeling conflicted. Part of her wanted to respond immediately, to assert her importance and authority. Another part hesitated, realizing that cooperation might be wiser even if it meant humility. She left the message unanswered, placing the phone beside her notebook. She sat quietly, letting the silence of her home and the quiet street outside settle over her. The weight of her recent experiences pressed on her, forcing reflection and reconsideration. For the first time, she understood that vigilance alone was not enough. She needed perspective, cooperation, and restraint. The next morning, she would face the street differently. She would observe, yes, but with a new understanding. She would record details, yes, but with care and clarity. She would act, yes, but with consideration of consequences. The events of the past days had been a lesson in accountability, in perspective, in the importance of measured action. And though she had once felt her vigilance was her power, she now realized that true strength lay in balance, in understanding, and in the ability to navigate the line between care and caution. The following morning was calm and cool. A soft breeze rustled the trees lining the street, and sunlight spilled gently over the lawns and driveways. Neighbors moved slowly about their routines, exchanging quiet greetings and tending to small chores. There was no rush, no urgency, and no signs of the tension that had occupied the neighborhood in recent days. Yet for the woman, the calm carried a weight she could not ignore. She awoke early. She always did, notebook beside her bed. The events of the past week pressed on her mind. The 911 call, the officer's questions, the neighbor's interventions. The reflection on her actions, all of it had changed something fundamental. She had once believed her vigilance made her powerful, in control, the sole guardian of her street. But now, she understood that control was never hers alone. Responsibility was shared, perception was limited, and actions had consequences she could not always anticipate. She sat quietly for a long moment, watching the sun rise over the neighborhood. She thought of the driver from days before, calm and oblivious to the drama that had unfolded. She thought of the officers, patient and methodical, guiding her toward accountability without harshness. She thought of her neighbors, who had approached her with respect, curiosity, and the desire to work together. Each memory reminded her that vigilance alone was not enough, that balance, understanding, and cooperation were essential. Her phone buzzed on the table. A message from a neighbor suggested a small gathering that afternoon to discuss neighborhood safety. The woman stared at the screen, her fingers hovering above the phone. Part of her wanted to ignore it, to retreat into solitude, to maintain the old sense of control she had always relied upon. Another part, the part she could not deny, urged her to respond, to engage, to embrace the lesson that had begun to unfold in the past days. After a long pause, she typed a simple reply, "I'll be there." She felt a mixture of anxiety and relief. Accepting the invitation was an acknowledgement of change, a step toward humility and collaboration. But it was also a small victory, a way to reclaim her role in the neighborhood in a positive, constructive manner. That afternoon, she arrived at the meeting. A few neighbors were already there, sitting on the porch of one of the houses, their expressions calm and welcoming. They greeted her politely, without judgment, and she returned their greetings with a tentative smile. The air was light, but attentive, the tension of previous days lingering only in memory. They began to discuss neighborhood safety, sharing ideas about observation, communication, and prevention. The woman listened carefully, occasionally contributing her thoughts, but this time with measured words, aware of the need for clarity and truth. She realized that speaking calmly, honestly, and collaboratively was far more effective than reacting impulsively or exaggerating. Her previous sense of authority based on fear and urgency was replaced by a more sustainable form of influence, one grounded in respect and reason. During the conversation, She noticed small gestures of trust and cooperation. Neighbors nodded when she spoke, asked questions without challenge, and offered their own insights openly. She felt a sense of belonging that had been absent in her previous attempts to control the street. The recognition she had sought through vigilance and alarm now came from dialogue and understanding. It was quieter, subtler, but far more powerful as the meeting ended. She walked back to her house, notebook in hand, reflecting on the events of the past week. She realized that the true lesson was not about watching others or calling authorities, but about awareness, balance, and collaboration. The power she had once believed was hers alone was in fact shared. Control came not from fear or drama, but from measured action, respect, and clear communication. In the days that followed, the street settled into a new rhythm. The woman continued her observations, but now with greater care and consideration. She spoke with neighbors before drawing conclusions, documented facts rather than assumptions, and used her vigilance to enhance understanding rather than create alarm. The small shifts in her behavior were noticed by others. The neighborhood grew calmer, more connected, and more trusting. She found satisfaction in the quieter form of influence. She no longer needed the dramatic sirens or the feeling of being the sole arbiter of safety. Her actions were guided by thoughtfulness, empathy, and honesty. She understood that being vigilant was important, but that the way she applied that vigilance mattered just as much. The respect she earned was grounded in collaboration rather than fear, truth rather than exaggeration. Evenings became moments of quiet reflection. She would sit by her window, notebook in hand, watching the soft glow of lights from neighboring homes. Children played outside safely, neighbors exchanged greetings, and the street felt alive yet calm. She felt a sense of peace that had been missing in the days of tension and uncertainty. Her mind no longer raced with imagined dangers. It focused on reality, observation, and understanding. Occasionally, she would think back to the 911 call, the officer's questions, and the driver's calm expression. Those moments, once filled with tension and defensiveness, now felt like lessons etched into her memory. She recognized that the chain of events had led her to a better understanding of herself, her neighbors, and the true meaning of vigilance. Time passed. The street maintained its calm rhythm. The woman remained alert, attentive, and conscientious, but with a tempered approach. She communicated openly, acted thoughtfully, and collaborated willingly. The neighborhood, once on edge, now thrived in mutual trust and understanding. The air of tension that had lingered dissipated, replaced by quiet confidence and a sense of shared responsibility. Looking back, she understood that the loudest lessons often came not from drama or conflict, but from reflection, accountability, and cooperation. The events of the past days, from the 911 call to the calm meetings with neighbors, had transformed her approach, her understanding, and her role in the community. And as she watched the sun set over the street, the glow of lights in windows, the soft laughter of neighbors, she felt a deep sense of calm. She had learned that vigilance, tempered with thoughtfulness and shared responsibility, was far more powerful than fear or control. The silence that now filled the neighborhood was not emptiness, but the quiet of understanding, respect, and connection. She had learned the hard way, but the lesson had taken root, and the street and her role within it had never been stronger.